real pleasure to be here. I was last in Warwick University, I think 25 years ago, possibly even 26 years ago, for a student union conference. It's a pleasure to be back and to see all the beautiful new buildings that have gone up to go along all the beautiful old buildings that were here when I was here before. And I very much like interactive meetings and engagement, so I would encourage you, if there's anything you don't understand or anything you don't agree with, just stick your hand up and ask. And when it comes to the questions at the end, I'm going to talk for about half an hour and then take questions for about 20 minutes after that. And I particularly welcome critical questions. If you just think that everything I've said is brilliant, you can buy a book at the end, and that's £15, so I'll be very grateful. But if you want to really question me about something I've said, I really appreciate that. So please don't feel constrained by some kind of phony politeness. Just get stuck in. This is the second book I've written. The first one was called The New Cold War, and very briefly it said Russia's going wrong under Putin, we need to watch out, and particularly we need to worry about dirty Russian money much more than we need to worry about Russian tax. And I did also warn there was going to be a war in Georgia, and that happened. And this one is focusing more on espionage. Espionage is one of the things that the Russian state can still do really well. They put a lot of money and a lot of effort into it, and as I argue in the book, they're better at it than we are, and we should mind about that. And I'm going to kick off briefly on the why we should mind. Now, hands up everybody in the room who knows who Sergei Magnitsky was. That's fantastic. That's really good. I apologise to you because I'm just going to, you will know already what I'm going to say. But Sergei Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer who was in effect murdered by corrupt officials after he exposed a huge fraud. And I always start off with this because I'm very critical of the Russian state, and people sometimes say, why are you anti-Russian? And I'm not anti-Russian, I'm actually really pro-Russian. I'm anti the people who killed Magnitsky and have done all the other bad things which I go into. I'm very much pro the ordinary Russians, the Russians who want their country to be prosperous and law-governed and successful and respected and integrated into the rest of the world. Now, Magnitsky was the sort of guy who might have studied at Warwick. He was a really good lawyer, corporate lawyer, who specialised in the boring back-office work that makes the stock market and other bits of the capitalist economy work. And his client was a foreign investor. Now, at this point, people usually start thinking, oh, this is going to be a story about how foreign investors get ripped off in Russia. It's not going to be that, because I don't go into bat for foreign investors who get ripped off in Russia or Ukraine or anywhere else. They often come complaining to The Economist, and they say, this is terribly unfair, I bought an oil field or a gas field or a smelter or something, and then my local partners have robbed me and the officials are treating me very badly and it's very unfair, and please will you write a story about it. And my answer to them is always this: if you go mud wrestling, you expect to get dirty. And if you want to invest in a very safe business environment, invest in Switzerland, and that's fine. If you invest in Russia, you may make a lot of money or you may lose it all, but the risk is in the price. So the fact that Magnitsky's client, his original client, was a big West investor called Bill Browder, was really nothing to do with it. The fact is that Magnitsky discovered a huge fraud. It involved a bogus tax refund. In fact, the biggest tax refund in Russian history, $230 million, which was also the fastest tax refund in Russian history, because it was applied for on the morning of the 24th of December and paid out in the afternoon. And the people behind this were senior officials, particularly officials in the FSB. The FSB is the Federal Security Service. It's one of the main successor organisations to the old KGB. And to put this in a British context, this would be as if you had the Crown Prosecution Service, the Metropolitan Police, Her Majesty's Revenue and Customs, MI5, Special Branch, and the Cabinet Office, all getting together to bankrupt a company, to then claim that as it was bankrupted it had made no profits, the taxes that it had paid on those profits should therefore be refunded, and then got this huge refund of about £170 million, $230 million, and then split it between them. That's what happened in Russia, and when Magnitsky exposed this, he was jailed on completely phony charges of fraud, And he was then told while he was in jail, if you switch sides, we'll let you out, and if you don't, you'll stay here. He got very sick. He was treated absolutely abominably. This is the first chapter of my book. He was treated very badly, overcrowded in sanitary conditions, and he became very ill. And he developed an agonizing complaint called pancreatitis. And on the last day of his life, he was beaten by 8 riot police with rubber truncheons, at which point he died. And nobody has been punished since then. The crime has not been investigated properly. There have been all sorts of phony blah blah excuses from the top, from people like President Medvedev, but in the end nothing's happened. Because that's actually the way Russia works. On the surface, you have courts, police, the Duma, the parliament, elected representatives, NGOs, media and so on, and to some extent they all function. They go through the motions. But behind the scenes, people like Magnitsky get murdered, and these huge amounts of money get stolen. Tens of billions of dollars get stolen in bribes, in frauds, and in rents from the natural resource industry. And I go into this in some detail in the second chapter of the book, where I describe what I call the pirate state. So this is a very bad deal for the Russians, this ex-KGB regime. Mr. Putin's been in power now for 12 years. He's had effectively unlimited money and enormous popularity. The beginning of his time in power, if he'd said to the Russians, you have to wear blue hats and orange trousers, they've done it. There was enormous popularity after the chaos and humiliation of the 1990s. People really wanted it to work, not only in Russia, actually, but also in the West. But in the end, it's been a real disappointment. Russia's not modernised. It's still this corrupt, very expensive state machine sitting on top of an economy that is perilously balanced on a narrow base of natural resource industries. Now you might say, hands up who's from Russia here? Okay, so for you guys, this is your country. This is your country and its resources and its future being stolen under your noses by this gang of incompetent, corrupt ex-spooks and what I call kleptocrats. So that's bad for you. But the rest of us who aren't Russian, why does that matter for us? Well, it matters for us because this regime is xenophobic and it doesn't like its neighbours and it doesn't like the West. And we see this very clearly. Now, I'm going to show you now a photo of this guy, Donald Heathfield. And I'm going to ask hands up who knows who Donald Heathfield was. Perfect. Perfect zero. Now, he was a colleague. I get a colleague, and who knows who this person was? Hands up. Almost every hand in the room goes up. Yeah. Someone didn't want to put his hand up, but he okay. Now, Donald Heathfield was a very interesting guy. He was probably the most successful Russian spy in the West in the post-communist era, working as an elite. There were other people who they recruited who worked inside the CIA, inside the FBI, inside other Western countries, and we get on to that in a moment. But Donald Heathfield was very unusual. He was, the real Donald Heathfield was a Canadian who died at the age of 3, dead Canadian baby. And Andrei Bezrukov turns up illegally in Canada and steals this identity. He applies for a passport, he gets it, he goes to York University in Canada, he then goes to the Kennedy School of Government, he goes to a posh management school in France, and he becomes a really successful management consultant. He's able to charge €5,000 a day for his services, and he specialises in future, in what he called himself a future studies expert. Now, I don't know, is anyone here studying management? Okay, well, I apologise. But I'm fairly sceptical about management consultants. I'm particularly sceptical about future studies. It's basically very expensive baloney. You tell them what you're worried about in the future, and then they tell you how to deal with it. And he had really good access to Fortune 500 companies. He consulted for a whole bunch of them and charged them these enormous fees, and he would have excellent access to top people. He'd say, tell me all about your company, what are you worried about, and would then give them advice. He even wrote a book, which you may or may not find in the Warwick University Library. In fact, a chapter in the book called Scenarios for Success. And I checked it out with our management consultant who writes the Schumpeter column in The Economist, and he said this is completely authentic. It's incomprehensible and very convincing. And so that was a kind of a good test. And he also produced some decision-making software. And I tracked down the guy who wrote the software, and it was basically a kind of Google Calendar with some sort of simple bells and whistles attached. But you fed in all your problems, and it would give you a kind of sequence of how to solve them. And he gave this software away free. He gave it away to governments, he gave it away to companies. And he was so keen to give it away that if people were a bit hesitant, he would say, I will even supply you with an intern who will install it and help you use it. And I tracked down one of these interns and interviewed him as well. Now, I think, and everybody who met Don Heathfield said he was a great guy. He was charming, he was well-read, cultured, good at his job, and you trust him with all your secrets. But I think those governments and those companies who trusted Don Heathfield would have been a bit less trusting if they'd known his real name was Andrei Bezrukov, and he'd actually graduated from Tomsk in 1981. And he'd been recruited by the then KGB, the first chief director of the KGB, and had been sent abroad as an illegal, along with his wife. I go into some detail about her in the book as well. Her real name was Vavilova, and she became an estate agent in Boston. So let nobody say that Russians don't suffer for the motherland. She actually went out and became an estate agent for another country, and that was pretty impressive. Probably even tougher than you imagine at the time. And they were they were 2 of the 10 people who were rounded up along with Anna Chapman. And it's quite interesting to speculate what he really found out. We don't really know. I did a bit of digging, and you can just imagine having basically KGB software installed on computers all over the place, updating itself automatically. What sort of potential that gives. But let me get on to Anna Chapman. Anna was a different kind of illegal. Don Heathfield was the old-fashioned kind based on a stolen identity. Very expensive to create, and actually very vulnerable, because you can easily trip up. If you're living a lie, then a small inconsistency can trap you. So, say for example, Canada had got round to computerising its birth registry and its death registry. They would then have noticed that although there was a birth certificate for Don Heathfield, there was also a death certificate for Don Heathfield, but there was also a passport issued for Don Heathfield. And then the whole story would come unstuck. I also tracked down someone who studied along with the Andrei Bezrukov and his wife in Tomsk in 1981, someone who now lives in America. This person, now an American citizen, travels regularly to Harvard, where Don Heathfield lived, and could have bumped into him at any moment and would have said, "Hi, Andrei, как дела? How are you?" And then the whole story would have been very vulnerable. Now, Anna Chapman was was what I call a new illegal. She was what she said she was. She really was Anna Chapman. She'd married a Brit called Alex Chapman. She'd taken on his name and had gained British nationality. And all the media frenzy was really very much focused on her, because for the Daily Mail, the Daily Express, and the Daily Telegraph, and all the other papers, it was an absolutely amazing fact that a young Russian woman has breasts and has sex. And this was just, absolutely incredible. And she was a spy as well. So there was an incredible sort of focus on Anna Chapman goes to a nightclub, Anna Chapman has a boyfriend, Anna Chapman has a short skirt, Anna Chapman, etc. So I was a bit puzzled by that, because I don't think it's a crime to be a young person, have a social life. So I started investigating what she got up to in Britain. And I quite quickly discovered that it was not a joke at all. That she had run a company called Southern Union, which was linked to a Zimbabwean company of the same name, run by a very dodgy Zimbabwean called Ken Sharp. I should stress here, because we've been recording this on the record, Ken Sharp denies all wrongdoing, and I have no evidence of any illegal activity by him. But he does feature in WikiLeaks cables, and you're welcome to read them, they're footnoted in the book. And Ken Sharp had a friend who was Anna Chapman's dad, so that's the connection. Anna Chapman's dad, senior Russian spy in Africa. And so Southern Union, I thought, would be worth investigating. And I then found a very unfortunate man called Steve Sumter, who was an electrician in Tunbridge Wells. And he'd been living an absolutely blameless life in Tunbridge Wells until June 2010, when MI5 came and knocked on his door and said, "Have you ever been to Russia? Do you know Anna Chapman? Are you a spy?" And they checked, they gave him a very thorough and rather uncomfortable grill. So it turned out he really had never been to Russia, he had nothing to do with it. They said, "Is this your signature?" "Yes." "Is this your date of birth?" "Yes." "Is this your name?" "Yes." "Can you explain why your name is there as a director of one of these companies run by Anna Chapman?" And the result, the answer was that his identity had been stolen. They had created a fake Stephen Sumter for purposes which one can only speculate about. It may have been money laundering, it may have been shoving money backwards and forwards to Zimbabwe, it may have had some intelligence connection, it may have been that they were trying to build up an identity for this fake Stephen Sumter. But there was another Stephen Sumter going around using this guy's identity. And nobody will help the real Stephen Sondland. MI5 saying their job is to catch spies and not criminals. They're not interested. They told him to shut up. For a long time he didn't do anything. Eventually he came to me. The police won't help him because they say they can't see quite what crimes being committed. Company's House won't help him, although his name is there, his signature's there on the documents at Company's House. And companies, including a directors alone, outstanding to him for tens of thousands, more than £10,000. And they say it's not their job to verify the documents they're given. So it's just in a small way, this is an example of somebody who's completely innocent can get sucked up in this espionage game. We still don't really know what Southern Union was for. I don't think it was for anything very nice. I get onto this more in questions, and of course if you buy the book you can read the whole story, there's a lot more. But anyway, I promised you 5 spies. I've shown you 2 so far. You may be saying, well hang on a minute, doesn't the West spy on Russia? And of course we do, and just occasionally we get it right. This is probably the most successful SIS spy, Secret Intelligence MI6 spy, in SIS's history. Unfortunately, it was a very long time ago. But he was an illegal. He lived underground in revolutionary Russia under very good fake papers, just in a way what Anna Chapman or what Don Heathfield was doing, more like Don Heathfield and Anna Chapman. And he spoke fantastic Russian, he could pass as a Russian, and he played the piano in the canteen of the military high command in Petrograd, dressed as a tramp, but he was also, just happened to be a very good concert pianist. And he got the most fantastic information about what Lenin was up to, how the Russian Civil War was going, all the different plots and schemes and so on. And he was unfortunately very badly treated by MI6. And although he was the first, he's the only MI6 officer to be knighted for his service, his clandestine service in the field. He was knighted when he got back, and I explained all about his adventures in the book. When he got back, he had borrowed a lot of money in St. Petersburg from the British merchants, as it were, the British Chamber of Commerce there, because MI6 was so incompetent. They had outsourced, the early British government outsourced it, they had outsourced the forgery of the rubles that he needed to some white Russians who were very incompetent printers. And they'd used ink that ran when it got wet. And so these banknotes, which were smuggled in to fund his operation, were completely useless. He then borrowed money from the British merchants. When they were finally chucked out of Petrograd in 1921, they came back to London and said to MI6, you owe us what would be in today's money, £700,000. To which MI6, in the best traditions of British bureaucracy, said, where's your paperwork? We're not going to pay anything, we haven't got a receipt. At which point Paul Dukes, rather magnificently, said that he would resign his knighthood publicly and say why he'd done it if MI6 didn't pay its bills. So at which point MI6 bravely then paid up and no more said. And I think that was probably one of the rare high points of British espionage against this murderous Chekist regime. It was in the midst of the Red Terror. It was when Lenin was before he got to Stalin, but in my view Lenin was just as bad. And that was a really good one. After that, it pretty much went downhill all the way. I just want to play you a clip here. This is a survivor of the most disastrous British operation ever inside the Soviet Union, Operation Jungle. Hands up anyone who's heard of Operation Jungle. Okay. In American, the CIA called it Operation Tungsten. And it's all still secret. There's nothing. The only way you can find out about it is to read about it in the KGB files and to interview survivors like this chap. He's dead now. But as far as MI6 is concerned, it's still secret and it never happened. And this involved recruiting Estonians, Latvians, Lithuanians, training them in Britain in the late 40s and early 50s, and sending them back into the Soviet Union to spy on the Soviet Union, to find out if the Soviets were planning a Third World War, and also to fight alongside the so-called Forest Brothers, the anti-communist partisans, who in those days were in large numbers in the forests of the Baltic states and western Ukraine as well. And unfortunately, it was a complete disaster. As I explained in the book, it was blown from the very beginning. It was blown from 1945 when they sent the first mission on shore, which meant not only did we find no useful intelligence, but a lot of the locals who we were trying to help ended up being killed. Just one small example, there was a meeting was summoned of the 14 main partisan commanders in Latvia in 1947. And they were told, using codes that they believed and passwords that they believed, that there was going to be a representative of British intelligence and a representative of the Latvian government in exile. were going to come to Riga, and they wanted to be briefed by the partisans on how the struggle was going. And so these 14 partisan units each sent their top commander, very brave men working in extreme influence, to Riga, where they met someone who spoke English, who seemed to be from MI6, and someone who spoke Latvian, who seemed to be from the Latvian government in exile. In fact, both men were from the NKVD, forerunner of the KGB, and having taken detailed notes of the briefing, all 14 partisan commanders were then tortured and killed. Exactly the same thing happened a few months later in Lithuania. So it was a real disaster. This guy is now dead. It was Kudierka. He was sent in, he was trained by MI6, recruited here in London in 1950, and was sent in as a radio operator, did his job very well, sending what he thought were very important messages back to London, but he was arrested, and it was clear from the very beginning, in fact, the guy he'd been sharing a bunker with in the forest, who he thought was another MI6 guy, actually turned out to be a KGB guy. And this is a clip from the film made in 1989, which, if the sound system is working, you'll be able to hear he's not pleased at all with MI6.
I took the risk and I knew the risk, but I hoped for normal work. But now what had happened? I was from the beginning put into like a blind kitten, put into the net of Soviet intelligence. So what was the risk for? What were all the sufferings and all the broken life? What it was for when from the beginning such a thing happened.
Kudierka was sentenced to 15 years imprisonment, but released after 2 years. Others served 20 years or were executed. In all, 30 agents have been lost. Those who returned to Britain were nervous wrecks.
Now, that voice you hear is Tom Bauer, who is just famous right now for having written the biography of Simon Cowell. That 25 years ago he was researching this and wrote the first book about this subject called Road Away. Now, it's not actually true that those who returned to Britain were nervous wrecks. Some of them were, and I tracked one down. There's one survivor of this, and he's still alive and living in Woking. You can read about him in the book. He's an Estonian. But there's also this guy. He is probably, along with Paul Dukes, this guy on the left here, is probably the other really successful British spy of the post-war era. And you can see him here shaking hands with his MI6 case officer. And this is on the Soviet-Norwegian frontier in the summer of 1952. He's just made an absolutely brilliant clandestine exit from the Soviet Union, having spent the summer spying on a Soviet nuclear airbase at Tartu in Estonia. And we know that he never got onto him because I've checked the KGB wanted list, which is an enormous great list of all the people that the KGB was on the lookout for from Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania. His name's not on it, neither his real name nor his code name or the name he adopted when he came back to Britain. So this was a really successful mission that went on, and it was, I think, part of a much bigger thing that went on under the noses of the Soviets. And perhaps it wasn't quite as big a disaster as Operation Jungle would make out. Anyway, there's a fair amount more about Voldemar Keep. Voldemar Keep then went on to train other spies in Britain, including he trained the guy who is now the King of Norway, which is I couldn't get the Norwegian royal family to comment on that, but I know it's true. Now, I promised you 5 spies, and here's the last one. Hands up anyone who knows who Hermann Sim is. Now, Hermann Sim was probably the most successful Russian spy that they recruited inside NATO. Heathfield was an extremely impressive Russian working in the West. Hermann Sim was an Estonian, and he was the top Estonian national security official. He was in charge of classified documents, security clearances, Estonian defence planning, and most importantly, Estonia's relationship with NATO. And he'd been a policeman in the Soviet era and ended up a rather senior policeman who played a very distinguished role in Estonia's struggle for independence. And when he finished being, he ended up as the chief of police in Estonia, and then became the head of security and head of information in the defence ministry, and oversaw Estonia's accession to NATO. And he was very popular, very well liked, very friendly, had excellent relationships with all the top people in NATO and all the top people in Estonia. He was present, for example, at a very important NATO counterintelligence conference in Brunssum in the Netherlands in 2006, where all 27 NATO countries did presentations on what they thought Russian espionage was up to in their country. And the results were all put together on a CD-ROM for ease of reference. except the Americans. And I tracked down the American who gave the American presentation. He said he was just not quite sure enough to put it on a CD-ROM. So 26 out of 27 presentations on a CD-ROM, and it was on Putin's desk the next morning, which Putin was very pleased, because unfortunately Herman Sim was, as well as being a very conscientious Estonian official, was also on the payroll of Russian intelligence. But he was very entrepreneurial. He was also spying for the Germans as well, because the Germans were very worried about what the Brits and Americans were up to in Estonia, and they wanted Sim to try and keep an eye on it. And I'm finished pretty much on this because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. But I think in a way it's really interesting. What did the Russians really want to know from Sim? Now obviously they wanted to know NATO secrets, but actually there aren't any NATO secrets. NATO secrets mean the economists can't get hold of them. It doesn't mean that the Russians can't get hold of them, because NATO is an alliance of 27 countries. And those countries which have real secrets, which are fairly few in number, because many NATO countries don't really have serious defence anymore, Luxembourg, Portugal, countries like that. But the countries that do have serious defence don't share their serious secrets within NATO. So a lot of the stuff that's NATO secret, top classified, isn't really secret at all. It's stuff you don't want terrorists to get hold of, where the next meeting is going to be, what's on the agenda and so on. But it's not that secret. So I don't take that terribly seriously. It was bad news for Estonia because Sim had a very good eagle's eye, bird's eye view of what's happening inside the Estonian elite. But what's really interesting about Sim was, what did the Russians task him? What were the Russians really interested in? And his case, I managed to get into, I'm the only journalist to interview Sim in prison. I got to see him, I had many interviews with him in his prison cell in Tartu after he was caught. And what the Russians really wanted to know was, what's the secret NATO plan to attack Russia from Estonia? Which is a bit like saying, where's the unicorn's nest at Warwick University? You can look for it, and you can look for it really hard. You can even be offered lots of money to find it, but you won't actually find it because it doesn't exist. And what was really paradoxical about this, at the time at which Sim was at the peak of his spy, 2004 to 2006, not only was there no NATO plan to attack Russia from Estonia, there was actually no NATO plan to defend Estonia from Russia. Because the Bush administration was so keen not to offend Putin, not to offend Russia, they said, okay, we will allow these countries to join, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland, Czechs, Slovaks, Hungarians, and the rest of them. We'd allow them to join it, but to show the Russians that it is not in any sense an aggressive move. We will not even draw up a threat assessment of how they might be under a military threat from Russia. And we will certainly not have any contingency plans to defend them. All they've got is Article 5, which says an attack on one NATO member is an attack on all. You can laminate that, you can laminate Article 5, you can put it on a border post, but more than that, you're not going to get it. So poor Sim's in this impossible position, because the Russians, thinking this, Putin and the others, thinking this very paranoid, typical sort of Czechy secret service mindset. Why else would NATO let the Bulls into NATO? The only reason they can do it is part of their plan against Russia. So there must be some plan for a secret base, for something there's something bad they're going to do. But Sim couldn't find it because it didn't exist. And so he was actually, by the end, the Russians were quite fed up with him. And I even suspect they may have encouraged him or helped the process that led to his being caught, because he was caught by a really brilliant bit of work by Estonian counterintelligence, working together with Lithuanians and the Brits and the Americans. He just touched on the kind of a few headlines really of all the stuff that's in the book. I can very happy to take questions about. I can talk more about espionage and how espionage works. I can talk more about Russia and why we should mind. I can talk more about Baltic states or any of those 5 spies that I mentioned, but I've done now 30 minutes and 30 seconds, and so now it's over to you guys.